The heavy wooden doors of the Charleston County Courthouse creaked open, allowing a flood of spectators to fill the grand yet suffocating courtroom. The air was thick with anticipation, whispers rippling like an undercurrent through the sea of journalists, concerned citizens, and uniformed officers. Sunlight streamed through the tall arched windows, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany floors, as if the very building itself was bracing for what was about to unfold. At the front of the room, presiding over the case, was Judge Robert Calloway, a man in his late 60s with silver hair and a deep furrowed brow that hinted at decades of hearing cases both righteous and corrupt. His reputation was one of fairness, but also of skepticism. He had seen enough courtroom theatrics to recognize when someone was playing to the crowd. And yet, something about this case felt different. Seated at the defendant's table was Evelyn Carter. Her dark brown skin glowed under the artificial lights, her presence calm and composed. Dressed in a navy blue blazer over a crisp white blouse, she exuded quiet strength. Though her hands rested lightly on the table, her posture was straight, her movements deliberate like a soldier waiting for orders. But Evelyn Carter wasn't just any defendant. She was a woman falsely accused of a crime she did not commit. The charges? Resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer. The officer? Gregory Tate. Across the aisle, Officer Gregory Tate sat at the plaintiff's table, his uniform neatly pressed, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent light. He projected an air of confident arrogance, even as he leaned back slightly, scanning the room as if he already knew the outcome. He had testified in dozens of cases before, his word always holding weight in the eyes of the court. After all, he was an officer of the law. The prosecution's table was manned by David Langston, a seasoned prosecutor known for his aggressive approach. His sharp suit and sharper tongue had secured convictions in cases with less evidence than this one. To him, this was just another defendant, another name in the system. He wasn't prepared for what was coming. Seated beside Evelyn was her defense attorney, Marcus Holloway. Young, ambitious, but visibly nervous. He adjusted his tie, flipping through his notes as if searching for some last-minute revelation. He had fought for clients before, but this case carried weight far beyond a simple courtroom victory. It was bigger than him, bigger than all of them. The bailiff stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. All rise. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Robert Calloway presiding. The room rose in unison. Judge Calloway adjusted his glasses, surveying the packed gallery before settling his gaze on the defendant. There was a flicker of curiosity in his expression. Evelyn Carter did not carry herself like a woman on trial. There was no desperation, no fear. Instead, she sat calmly, calculating. Be seated, the judge ordered, his voice firm. The room settled, the wooden benches creaking under the weight of those eager to witness what had already become a high-profile case. The bailiff took a deep breath and cleared his throat. Case number 2025-064, the State of South Carolina versus Evelyn Carter. From the back row, a few murmurs broke out. The air was charged with speculation, curiosity, and, for some, quiet doubt. Evelyn exhaled slowly, her fingers grazing the edge of the table. She knew what was coming. She had seen battlefields before, but today, the battlefield was a courtroom. And she was ready. A hush settled over the courtroom as Prosecutor David Langston stood from his seat, buttoning his suit jacket with a slow, deliberate motion. He turned toward the jury, scanning their faces before shifting his gaze to Officer Gregory Tate, who sat at the plaintiff's table, posture straight, hands folded in front of him like a model officer. Your Honor, Langston began, his voice crisp and authoritative. The state calls Officer Gregory Tate to the stand. There was a rustle of movement as Tate stood, adjusting his uniform as he walked toward the witness stand. His movements were controlled, almost theatrical, as if he had rehearsed this moment countless times. He approached the stand with the confidence of a man who had been here before, who had spoken under oath and always been believed. As the bailiff administered the oath, Tate placed his right hand on the Bible, his left raised. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. He took his seat, adjusting the microphone, then turned to Langston with a practiced, unreadable expression. Officer Tate, Langston began, stepping closer. Please walk the court through the events of the night in question. Tate cleared his throat and nodded, his voice smooth and steady. On the evening of March 17th, at approximately 9:45 p.m., I was patrolling near Magnolia and 5th Street when I observed the defendant, Miss Carter, loitering outside a closed business. The area had seen a recent uptick in burglaries, so I stopped to question her. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The word loitering had weight, especially in a city like Charleston, where it had often been used as a pretext for unwarranted police stops. Judge Calloway gave a sharp glance toward the gallery, and the noise died down. Langston nodded. And what happened next? I approached her, identified myself, and asked what she was doing there. Tate continued. Instead of cooperating, she became agitated, hostile, even. She refused to provide identification and demanded to know why I was questioning her. He sighed, shaking his head as if recounting a particularly frustrating encounter. I tried to de-escalate the situation, but Miss Carter refused to comply. She raised her voice, squared up to me, and, before I knew it, she struck me forcefully against the chest. At that point, she attempted to grab my service weapon, leaving me with no choice but to restrain her. The courtroom fell into stunned silence, broken only by the faint scratching of reporters jotting notes. At the defense table, Evelyn Carter did not move. Not a single muscle in her face twitched. She simply sat, hands clasped, eyes locked on Tate, watching, studying. Marcus Holloway shifted uneasily beside her, whispering, "Stay calm." She didn't respond. Langston continued, his voice taking on an air of righteous authority. "Officer Tate, you are a decorated officer with 10 years on the force. Have you ever had a complaint filed against you for excessive force?" Tate shook his head, his voice firm. "Never." "A lie." Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. Langston pressed on. "And when you restrained Miss Carter, did you use any excessive force?" "Absolutely not," Tate replied without hesitation. "I followed standard procedure. I issued verbal commands, which she ignored. I had to act in the interest of public safety." Langston nodded, stepping away slightly. "And your body camera?" Tate hesitated just for a fraction of a second. But Evelyn saw it. "Unfortunately," Tate said smoothly, "my body camera malfunctioned at the time of the arrest. A technical issue. These things happen." From the back of the courtroom, a low mutter could be heard. "Yeah, happens every time they don't want us to see the truth." Judge Calloway banged his gavel sharply. "I will have order in this courtroom." Evelyn finally spoke her first words since Tate took the stand. So convenient. Her voice was calm, controlled. But those two words cut through the air like a blade. Tate's eyes flickered toward her for the first time. For the first time since this trial began, he looked nervous. Langston ignored her. He turned back to Tate. "Officer, do you stand by your testimony?" "Yes, I do." "And you are telling this court, under oath, that Miss Carter attempted to reach for your weapon?" "I am," Tate said, lifting his chin slightly. Langston turned toward Judge Calloway. "No further questions, Your Honor." Calloway nodded. "Defense, your witness." Marcus rose slowly from his chair. He straightened his jacket, exhaled through his nose, then walked toward the stand. As he reached the center of the courtroom, he turned slightly, glancing at Evelyn. She nodded once. A signal. "Officer Tate," Marcus began, his voice smooth, but edged with steel, "let's talk about the truth." The battle had begun. The air in the courtroom had changed. It was no longer just thick with tension, it was charged. The weight of Officer Gregory Tate's testimony still hung in the air, but there was a shift. At the defense table, Evelyn Carter sat motionless, her hands lightly clasped, her gaze unwavering. She had listened to every word, every lie, and yet, she had not reacted. But now, it was her turn. Marcus Holloway adjusted his tie, stepping forward with measured confidence. He turned to face Judge Robert Calloway, who watched him carefully from the bench. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call Miss Evelyn Carter to the stand." A ripple of murmurs swept through the gallery. People leaned forward, anticipation thick in the air. They had heard Tate's version of events. Now, they wanted to hear hers. Judge Calloway nodded. "Miss Carter, please take the stand." Evelyn rose slowly, deliberately. There was no hesitation, no nervous glances. She moved with purpose, like a woman who had nothing to fear. As she walked toward the witness stand, Officer Tate shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time, His earlier confidence seemed to waver. She placed her hand on the Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do." She took her seat, adjusting the microphone. Her back remained straight, her hands folded neatly on the stand. Her presence alone commanded the room. Marcus Holloway approached, his voice calm but steady. "Miss Carter, can you tell this court what happened on the night of March 17th? A brief pause. Then, Evelyn spoke. "I can. But first, I want to make one thing very clear." Her voice was calm, yet powerful, the kind of voice that demanded attention without having to raise a single decibel. Officer Tate's account is not just inaccurate, it is intentionally misleading. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even Judge Calloway raised an eyebrow. From the plaintiff's table, Prosecutor David Langston scoffed. "Bold claim, Miss Carter," he interjected, folding his arms. "Do you have proof?" Evelyn turned her head toward him, meeting his gaze with an eerie stillness. "The truth," she said, "has a way of revealing itself. Counselor. You'll see soon enough." Langston's smirk faltered. Marcus continued. "Miss Carter, let's go back to that night. Where were you before your encounter with Officer Tate?" "I had just left a friend's house and stopped on the sidewalk to check my phone for directions." Evelyn replied. "Did you enter or attempt to enter any businesses?" "No." "Did you engage in any suspicious activity?" "No." Marcus nodded, pacing slightly in front of the jury. "And then Officer Tate approached you?" "Yes." "He pulled up in his patrol car, stepped out, and immediately shined his flashlight in my face." "Did he state why he was questioning you?" "Not at first. He asked what I was doing there, but his tone was aggressive, accusatory, like he had already made up his mind about me." A ripple of murmurs spread through the jury. Marcus turned to the stand again. "Miss Carter, when Officer Tate asked for your identification, what did you do?" Evelyn's expression remained unreadable. "I asked if I had done anything wrong. I knew my rights. Standing on a public sidewalk isn't a crime." "And how did Officer Tate respond?" Evelyn's jaw tightened slightly. "He raised his voice. Accused me of being uncooperative. Told me people like me always had an attitude." The room stilled. Marcus stepped forward. "People like you." Evelyn nodded. "Yes, that's what he said. People like you need to learn how to listen." Judge Calloway's gavel slammed down hard. "Order in the court." The gallery erupted, a mixture of shock and disbelief. Even some of the jurors exchanged uneasy glances. From the plaintiff's table, Tate's jaw clenched. Marcus let the moment hang in the air before continuing. "Miss Carter, did you ever raise your voice? Did you ever make a threatening movement toward Officer Tate?" "No," Evelyn said firmly. "Did you ever reach for his weapon?" She shook her head. "Absolutely not." Marcus turned toward the jury. "Yet, Officer Tate claims you did. And conveniently, his body camera malfunctioned. Does that seem coincidental to you?" Evelyn let out a slow breath. "No, Mr. Holloway, it doesn't." A heavier silence settled in. Marcus turned back to Judge Calloway. "Your Honor, the defense requests a brief recess before we continue questioning." Judge Calloway studied Evelyn carefully. She had not raised her voice once. She had not pleaded or defended herself like most defendants would. Instead, she had simply spoken the truth. And that truth had already begun to shake the foundation of the case. Calloway finally nodded. "Court will recess for 15 minutes. He banged the gavel, and the room erupted into whispers. Evelyn stood from the stand, turning to walk back toward her seat. As she passed Officer Tate, their eyes met. And for the first time, his confidence cracked. 15 minutes felt like an eternity. The courtroom buzzed with energy as people whispered theories, exchanged glances, and speculated about what was to come. Evelyn Carter's testimony had done something no one expected. It shifted the weight of the case. Officer Gregory Tate had walked into the courtroom with the arrogance of a man who expected to win. Now, he sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture rigid, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming against the table in restless agitation. He knew what was coming. The door at the back of the courtroom swung open. Judge Calloway entered, his robe billowing slightly as he took his seat. The bailiff called the court to order, and the chatter in the gallery died down in an instant. "Mr. Holloway," Judge Calloway said, adjusting his glasses, "you may proceed with your cross-examination." Marcus Holloway stood, smoothing his tie as he approached the witness stand. He didn't look at the jury. Not yet. Instead, he turned to Officer Tate, who was once again called to the stand. Officer Tate, Marcus began, his voice smooth but deliberate. Earlier, you testified that my client, Miss Carter, became aggressive, struck you in the chest, and attempted to seize your weapon. Do you still stand by that statement? Tate lifted his chin slightly. Yes, I do. Marcus nodded, pacing slightly. And you also testified that, unfortunately, your body camera malfunctioned at the time of the incident. Is that correct? Tate hesitated for half a second, just enough time for the jury to notice. That's correct, he answered, his voice noticeably less confident. Marcus stopped pacing. Tell me, Officer Tate, how often does your body camera malfunction during an arrest? Tate blinked. Not often. But it happens, he said quickly. Marcus raised an eyebrow. In your 10 years on the force, how many times has it happened? Tate shifted in his seat. I don't have an exact number. Marcus let a silence stretch. The jury was listening now. Would you say it's happened more than 5 times? No. More than 3? No. So, Marcus said, just this once, at the exact moment you arrested my client? Tate clenched his jaw. It was just an unfortunate coincidence. Marcus smiled slightly. Right. A coincidence. He turned sharply toward the jury, his voice steady, measured. Ladies and gentlemen, this officer would have you believe that his body camera conveniently failed at the very moment he claims my client reached for his weapon. He would have you believe that the only proof of his claims is his word. Silence. Marcus let the weight of that hang in the air before turning back to Tate. Now, officer, let's discuss something you didn't mention in your report. Would you like to explain why you called my client people like you and told her she needed to learn how to listen? Tate visibly stiffened. Langston shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is inflammatory and based on unverified claims. Judge Calloway peered over his glasses at Langston. Objection overruled. Answer the question, Officer Tate. Tate's face darkened. He hesitated. I don't recall saying that, he muttered. Marcus stepped forward. You don't recall? Or you don't want to admit it? The gallery murmured. Tate exhaled through his nose. I don't recall. Marcus gave a slow nod. That's fine, Officer Tate. Because I believe we have something that will refresh your memory. Tate froze. Langston's head snapped up. Judge Calloway narrowed his eyes. Mr. Holloway, do you have additional evidence? Marcus walked back to the defense table and picked up a small USB drive. Your Honor, he said, his voice unwavering. The defense would like to introduce a recording into evidence. The entire courtroom held its breath. Langston was already on his feet. Your Honor, this was not submitted during discovery. It was just obtained, Marcus interrupted, his voice firm. A bystander, who was reluctant to come forward, recently sent it to my office. It was recorded from inside a nearby parked car. The court has the right to review relevant new evidence. Judge Calloway studied Marcus carefully, then turned to the bailiff. Play the recording. The bailiff took the USB and inserted it into the court's media system. The screen flickered to life. The video was grainy, taken from a dashcam. The angle wasn't perfect, but it showed Officer Tate standing over Evelyn Carter. The audio was clear. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Tate's voice crackled through the speakers. I haven't done anything wrong, Evelyn's voice replied, calm but firm. You people always have an attitude. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. You need to learn how to listen, Tate's voice sneered. The murmurs exploded. Judge Calloway banged his gavel repeatedly. Order in the court. The courtroom was no longer on Tate's side. Tate was pale. His fingers clenched. His eyes darted toward Langston, toward the officers in the back row, but no one was coming to his defense. Marcus turned back to the jury, his voice steady and powerful. Ladies and gentlemen, we were told this was a case about law and order, about resisting arrest. But what you just heard, that wasn't about the law. That was about power, about control, about a man who thought no one would question his word. He turned back to Tate. But we are questioning it now, Officer Tate. And for the first time, you don't have an answer. Tate's lips pressed into a thin line. The walls of his carefully constructed lie were starting to collapse. And Evelyn Carter. She sat there, watching it all unfold. her composure as unshaken as ever. The courtroom was in chaos. Gasps still lingered in the air. Officer Gregory Tate's words, captured so clearly on the dashcam footage, were replaying in everyone's mind. "You people always have an attitude. You need to learn how to listen." His arrogance. His entitlement. His abuse of power. Everything he had tried to cover up was now laid bare before the court. Judge Calloway had banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order. But no one in the room could ignore the undeniable shift that had just taken place. And yet Evelyn Carter still had not reacted. She sat stone still at the defense table. Her hands lightly folded, her expression unreadable. Marcus Holloway, her attorney, glanced at her, his voice low. "It's time, Evelyn." She didn't nod. Didn't shift. She simply stood. The movement alone was enough to silence the entire room. Evelyn Carter walked toward the witness stand, with the precision of someone who had walked into battle before. Not a single person in the courtroom missed the way her back remained impossibly straight. Her steps measured, her presence almost commanding. As she took her seat, the gallery held its breath. Even Officer Tate, who had once been so smug, looked uneasy now. Marcus approached the stand, but this time, his demeanor was different. "Carter," he began, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "there has been a great deal of speculation about your background. The prosecution has painted you as just another civilian, a woman who, as Officer Tate claims, became aggressive for no reason. But that's not the whole truth, is it?" Evelyn tilted her head slightly. The faintest ghost of a smile appeared at the corner of her lips. "No, it isn't." A murmur spread through the jury box. "Would you please tell this court?" Marcus paused, then turned to the jury, locking eyes with them one by one before finishing his sentence, "who you really are?" The silence was deafening. And then Evelyn spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, unshakable. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Carter." The courtroom froze. She let the words settle before continuing. "For 20 years, I served in the United States Navy. I was a SEAL, one of the few women in history to hold that title. I led teams on classified missions. I operated in war zones most Americans will never hear about. I have been trained to survive under the most extreme conditions, to de-escalate high-risk situations, and to make split-second decisions that determine life and death." She exhaled slowly, her voice unwavering. "And yet, none of that mattered when Officer Tate looked at me on that sidewalk. Because to him, I wasn't an officer. I wasn't a veteran. I wasn't a person who had risked my life for this country." She turned and locked eyes with Tate. "To him, I was just someone he could control." The courtroom erupted. Gasps. Shouts. The shock was undeniable. The jury members exchanged stunned glances. Even Judge Calloway, for the first time all day, looked visibly shaken. "Order in the court." The judge slammed his gavel, but his voice lacked its usual force. He was just as stunned as everyone else. Evelyn didn't move, didn't blink. She let the truth settle. At the prosecution table, David Langston looked like he had swallowed glass. And Officer Tate? He was white as a sheet. His fingers gripped the edge of the table so tightly, his knuckles turned bone white. His mouth opened then closed. He had nothing. Marcus let the silence stretch. He wanted them to sit in it. Then, he turned back to Evelyn. "Lieutenant Commander Carter," he said, emphasizing every syllable, "based on your extensive military training, do you believe Officer Tate ever had reason to perceive you as a physical threat?" Evelyn shook her head. "No." "Did you ever reach for his weapon?" "No." "Did you ever pose any danger to him at all?" Her voice was firm. The only danger in that situation was Officer Tate's ego. A sharp gasp cut through the room. Tate stood suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I didn't know who she was," he blurted. The moment the words left his mouth, he knew it was a mistake. Marcus turned like a shark sensing blood. "Let me make sure I understand you, Officer Tate," he said slowly. "You're saying that if you had known she was a decorated Navy SEAL, you would have treated her differently?" Tate's mouth opened, then shut. Marcus took a step closer. "Then tell me, Officer Tate, why should it have mattered? Why should Evelyn Carter's title be the only reason you afford her the respect every citizen deserves?" The entire courtroom was holding its breath. Tate's lips parted, but no words came. He had nothing. Marcus turned to the jury. "This is what happens when power goes unchecked. When an officer, sworn to protect and serve, believes he is above scrutiny. When a woman, a war hero, can be thrown against a patrol car, humiliated, because someone like him decided she didn't deserve basic decency. He turned back to Tate. But now you know who she is, don't you? Tate looked away. Marcus took a slow step back, then nodded toward Evelyn. No further questions. He returned to the defense table. Evelyn followed, walking past Tate without a second glance. And as she took her seat, the weight of the truth settled upon the room. The trial was no longer about what had happened that night. It was about something far bigger. And Officer Tate knew it. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that weighed down on everyone, pressing against their chests, making each breath feel heavier than the last. Officer Gregory Tate sat motionless at the plaintiff's table. His once proud demeanor was shattered, his confidence gone. The weight of Evelyn Carter's revelation had landed on him like a hammer, and now, he was crumbling under its force. The jury had seen everything. He knew it. The courtroom, once filled with murmurs of doubt, was now silent not out of respect, but because everyone knew what was coming. At the defense table, Evelyn Carter sat as composed as ever. Marcus Holloway, her attorney, gave her a subtle nod before standing and walking toward the jury with deliberate steps. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice low but filled with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. "You have heard two versions of this story." He gestured toward Officer Tate, who sat stiff and pale, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "On one hand, you have Officer Tate's version. A decorated police officer claims he was assaulted by a woman who refused to comply. A woman who, by his account, was belligerent, dangerous, and posed a threat to his safety." Marcus let the words linger. No one in the room believed that anymore. He took another step closer to the jury. "And then, there's the truth." He turned to Evelyn. "Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Carter, a woman who has served this country for 20 years. A woman who has commanded soldiers in battle, who has stared down real danger, real threats. A woman who, on that night, was simply trying to exist without being harassed by someone who believed his badge placed him above accountability." Marcus slowly turned back to the jury, his voice growing stronger. "I ask you, who do you believe?" A heavy silence fell over the room. No one looked at Tate. Not the jury, not the judge, not even his fellow officers in the back row. For the first time, he was truly alone. Marcus let out a slow breath. This case is not just about one false arrest. It is about something bigger. It is about what happens when power is given without accountability. It is about what happens when an officer, sworn to uphold the law, weaponizes it against those he deems unworthy of respect. His eyes swept across the room. "And today, you have a chance to prove that the truth still matters." He turned back to the judge. "The defense rests." With that, he returned to his seat. Evelyn gave him a single nod. Judge Calloway shifted in his chair, clearing his throat as he adjusted his glasses. His expression was unreadable, but the way he sat forward slightly told everyone that he, too, understood the gravity of this moment. "We will now hear closing arguments from the prosecution," he announced. David Langston, the prosecutor, stood slowly, but his movements lacked their previous confidence. He pulled at the cuffs of his jacket, exhaled sharply, and approached the jury, but there was nothing left for him to say. His arguments had already fallen apart. His witness had been exposed. His strongest piece of evidence, Officer Tate's testimony, had been completely destroyed. Still, he tried. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started. But his voice lacked the force it had carried earlier. "Law enforcement officers make difficult decisions every day. They are placed in dangerous situations, and they must act quickly to protect themselves and the public." He turned slightly toward Tate. "Perhaps Officer Tate misjudged the situation. Perhaps mistakes were made." He swallowed hard. "But does that mean we disregard the risks officers face daily? Does that mean we assume the worst of them? I ask you to consider not only this case but the bigger picture. And I trust that you will make the right decision." With that, he sat down. The jury didn't move. Judge Calloway let out a slow breath. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice heavier than before, "you have been presented with the evidence. You have heard the testimony. It is now your duty to deliberate." The bailiff led them out of the courtroom, and as the doors shut behind them, A deep stillness settled over the room. Marcus leaned toward Evelyn. "How do you feel?" She didn't hesitate. "Like I already know the verdict." He smiled slightly. "So do I." And then, they waited. The verdict. It didn't take long. Less than 2 hours later, the jury returned. The courtroom filled once more, but the tension had changed. Evelyn sat at the defense table, calm, composed. Officer Tate sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. His face was blank, but his eyes flickered with something close to panic. Judge Calloway sat forward. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson, an older woman with a measured expression, stood. "Yes, Your Honor. Please read the verdict." She unfolded a piece of paper. "In the case of the state of Georgia versus Evelyn Carter, we, the jury, find the defendant." A pause. Tate held his breath. "Not guilty on all charges." The courtroom erupted. A mixture of relief, disbelief, and justice swept through the gallery. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, then exhaled. She already knew. Judge Calloway banged his gavel sharply. "Order." The room settled. The foreperson continued. "Furthermore, we, the jury, strongly recommend that Officer Gregory Tate be investigated for misconduct and perjury." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Judge Calloway nodded. "This court will take that recommendation under advisement." Officer Tate flinched. "I suggest you retain counsel. This matter is far from over." He sank in his chair. His career, his reputation, everything was slipping away. The gavel slammed down. "Court is adjourned." Evelyn stood. And for the first time in a long time, justice had prevailed. The courtroom emptied slowly, but the weight of what had happened still lingered in the air. Officer Gregory Tate sat motionless, his once proud demeanor reduced to nothing but a shell of the arrogance he had carried into this trial. The murmurs around him were not of support, but condemnation. His fellow officers avoided his gaze. He was alone now. At the defense table, Evelyn Carter stood. Her movements were measured, controlled. She had spent years in battlefields, but this had been a different kind of war, a war fought not with weapons, but with truth. And today, the truth had won. Marcus Holloway turned to her, a small but knowing smile on his lips. "You did it," he said, voice low. Evelyn met his gaze. "No," she corrected, "we did it." He nodded, a flicker of respect passing between them. But as the courtroom doors opened, they were met with a wall of flashing cameras. The media had been waiting for this moment. Journalists surged forward, microphones shoved toward Evelyn's face. "Commander Carter, what are your thoughts on the verdict? Do you think Officer Tate will face criminal charges? What does this mean for the justice system?" Evelyn lifted a hand just slightly, but the effect was immediate. Silence. She stood at the top of the courthouse steps, the Georgia sun casting a golden glow behind her. The image was powerful, a woman who had fought both on foreign soil and in her own country, standing victorious once again. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, unshaken. "This isn't just my victory," she began, her gaze scanning the crowd. "This is a victory for accountability, for justice, for the truth." The crowd leaned in. "But let me be clear, justice shouldn't be a battle." A hush fell over the reporters. "I spent 20 years serving this country, putting my life on the line to protect the freedoms we all hold dear. And yet, the moment I questioned a man with a badge, I was treated as a criminal. I was thrown against a patrol car, humiliated, and falsely accused." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "And I know I am not the only one." A murmur swept through the crowd. How many others don't get their day in court? How many others don't have the resources to fight back? How many others are silenced before they ever have the chance to speak? The silence that followed was deafening. Today, I was lucky. I had proof. I had a voice. And I had people willing to fight beside me. But this fight isn't over, not for me, and not for the countless others still waiting for justice. The cameras flashed. The world was listening. So I won't stop here. I will continue to speak out, to demand accountability, to ensure that those who abuse their power are held responsible. Because justice isn't just a verdict, it's a standard. And it's time we start holding everyone to it. The crowd erupted in applause. Evelyn gave one final glance toward the courthouse, the place where she had fought, where she had won. Then, she turned and walked away. She didn't look back, because the fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. 1 year later, the name Evelyn Carter became more than just a name. It became a symbol. The case sparked national conversations about police accountability and the misuse of power. It forced departments across the country to review their policies, to question the unchecked authority that had gone unchallenged for too long. And Officer Gregory Tate, he didn't just lose his badge. He lost everything. An internal investigation uncovered years of misconduct complaints that had been buried, cases that had been dismissed. He was charged with perjury, excessive force, and abuse of power, and this time, he was the one standing in front of a judge. Meanwhile, Evelyn Carter didn't return to a quiet life. She became a force. She traveled the country, speaking to audiences, pushing for change, working with organizations dedicated to fighting injustice. She mentored young women in law enforcement and the military, ensuring that the next generation would never feel powerless in the face of corruption. And every time she stood in front of a crowd, she left them with the same words: "The truth will always find a way." Because it had, and it always would. Evelyn Carter's story is more than just a courtroom battle. It is a testament to the power of truth, resilience, and standing up for what is right. Too often, those in positions of power believe they are untouchable, that their authority will shield them from accountability. But as Evelyn proved, no one is above the truth. Lies may last for a time, but they will always crumble under the weight of evidence, integrity, and courage. Her journey also reminds us that justice should never be a privilege, it should be a right. It is a fight that does not end with one verdict or one victory. Change requires constant vigilance, persistence, and the willingness to speak out, even when the odds seem impossible. For many, especially those who have seen decades of history unfold, this lesson is familiar. It echoes the struggles of past generations who fought for civil rights, fairness, and respect. Evelyn's story is a modern reminder that every voice matters, and every action counts. So, whether in a courtroom, in a community, or even in everyday conversations, never underestimate the power of truth. Because truth, once spoken, can change everything. Evelyn Carter's story is a powerful reminder that courage, truth, and resilience can overcome even the deepest injustices. It is not just about one person's fight. It is about a movement toward accountability and fairness for all. If this story inspired you, leave a like and subscribe to hear more powerful stories about justice, perseverance, and the human spirit.